Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. My name is Isaac Workman. I'm the Senior Vice President at the Federalist Society for Communications and National Programs. It's my honor to welcome you here today to the inaugural Structural Constitution Initiative Executive Branch Summit. I'll say more about today's summit in a moment, but first I want to thank Mr. Eric Wesson, who is our co-chair for the executive branch pillar. He is the Solicitor General of Iowa, and active and engaged participation from our membership is a key component to our success of the Federalist Society. And Eric, we appreciate you. Please join me in appreciating Eric for his service. When the delegates to the Constitutional Convention completed their work in September of 1787, the results were seismic. With just 3 words, everything changed. We, the people. It was a radical idea. Self-government by the people. Speaking concerning the new Constitution, an 81-year-old Benjamin Franklin observed that when men assemble together to reason, they bring with them their wisdom, but they also bring their prejudices, their passions, and their private interests, and that a perfect system of government was unlikely from such an assembly. And yet the history reflects that Franklin was astonished at just how close to perfection that Constitution came. Our inspired Constitution is a framework designed not to provide answers to every question, but to provide the conditions under which each generation could reason together and find answers within a structure strong enough to hold. But at the moment those words were written, they were aspirational. As the ink on We the People was drying, the founders still had to make their case to the people, a fractious and skeptical nation who was considering this untested framework and what it would mean for them. Their work was an invitation to the people and through them to history. They had to make this case publicly, rigorously, and persistently for why the structure was not a threat to liberty, but its surest protection. And this case was made perhaps most prominently in the Federalist Papers, where James Madison, particularly through Federalist 47 through 51, walks the readers through and makes his case for why the new Constitution was the answer to unify America. And in those papers, his focus is not rights. He is not focused on rights. He is focused on structure, the structure of the Constitution. Separate the powers. Make the structure the guardian of liberty. And that structure was not limited to the balance of powers between the branches of the federal government, but also how it would be laid out between the federal government, the new national government, and the states. It was a profound idea. It was not an obvious one. And it was argued for, it was deliberated over, and it was ratified state by state through a national conversation amongst the people who had to consider what type of government they desired for themselves and for their posterity. Which is what brings us here today. When the Federalist Society was founded over 40 years ago, our mission statement declared that the separation of governmental powers is central to our Constitution. This conviction, of course, rooted in the founders' insight. Building on more than 40 years of experience, the Federalist Society's new Structural Constitution Initiative will convene judges, lawyers, scholars, students, policymakers for serious dialogue about how our constitutional structure has protected and enshrined our liberties for the last 250 years, and how working within that structure, we can secure our liberties for the next 250 years. Under this initiative, we will host academic colloquia, SCI webinars, we will convene salon dinners and curate scholarship that will focus on our structure. This programming will elevate the discourse and the public understanding around the proper role of government between the federal branches, but also between the federal government and the states, but also focus on the states and focus more on state governments and the relationship among the states, where we have circumstances where the actions of one state might have a regulatory or an extraterritorial regulatory effect on a neighboring state. When Benjamin Franklin left Philadelphia that September morning, he was cautiously hopeful. He had spent the summer observing men arguing their strong opinions imperfectly, stubbornly, and sometimes brilliantly towards something none of them could have produced alone. And he gave his consent, not because he was certain of the outcome, but because he believed in the power of what good faith deliberation could achieve. And for men and women of enduring faith in our continuing American masterpiece, that work is never finished. Thank you for joining the Federalist Society and carrying it forward. I would now like to introduce our guest who will be delivering opening remarks, opening today's summit, Mr. Stanley Woodward, Jr. Mr. Woodward serves as the as the Associate Attorney General at the U.S. Department of Justice. He's in the third highest ranking position at the department, and we're delighted to have him here today to share some remarks. Mr. Woodward.
Good morning. Thank you all for being here. I will not be offended if you quickly Google Associate Attorney General. I had not heard of it either. As my dear friend and our acting Attorney General Todd Blanche likes to remind me, I've gone from being an associate at a law firm. These are jokes you can only make with lawyers, right? I've gone from being an associate at a law firm, partner, founding my own firm, defense counsel, and hopefully what will be the most high-profile criminal defense of our lifetimes, because we don't want that again, to being associate again. So it's an honor to be here. Thank you for inviting me to attend the inaugural Executive Branch Summit of the Structural Constitutional Initiative here at the Mayflower Hotel. The Mayflower, of course, has a storied history. After all, it was in this very hotel that presidents, cabinet officials, foreign leaders, political operatives, and journalists have been quietly shaping the executive branch. But I think that what we're here to do is to say no more. Let me begin with an acknowledgement that may come as a surprise. To some members of the press, it is especially good to see you here in person in my current capacity as a Senate-confirmed, presidentially appointed official. With a working badge, an active email account, and at least as of this morning, no forwarding address. In Washington, that qualifies as stability. Truly, it is an honor to be here, particularly at a conference devoted not simply to policy outcomes, but to constitutional structure itself. Because structure matters. If it didn't, then the Soviet Union would boast a better constitution than ours. The Soviet Union Constitution guaranteed way more than what is promised in our Bill of Rights. It guaranteed a right to rest and leisure. That sounds phenomenal right about now. Indeed, every banana republic in the world has an official document full of aspirations. But those are just words on paper, or what our framers would have called parchment guarantees. The real key to American exceptionalism is the structure of our government. Without a secured structure of separated powers, our Bill of Rights would be worthless, as are the bills of rights of many nations across the globe. Our Constitution is an architecture of power. It assigns responsibility. It creates accountability. It channels democratic authority through institutions specifically designed to preserve liberty. And one of the central structural questions of our time is this: who actually governs the executive branch? Now, for most of American history, that question would have sounded almost absurd. Article 2 is not exactly ambiguous. It states quite clearly, and I quote, "The executive power shall be vested in the President of the United States," end quote. Not a committee, not in the agencies and departments that increasingly behave as though they answer to themselves, not in insulated bureaucracies operating according to their own institutional preferences, and certainly not in anonymous officials convinced they are morally entitled to override elected leadership because they oppose the agenda the American people voted for. The framers understood something fundamental. Liberty is protected not merely by limiting power, but by locating it clearly. As Justice Scalia often reminded us, structure is everything. His famous dissent in Morrison v. Olson rightly explained that our Constitution ingeniously allocates, quote, power among Congress, the President, and the courts in such fashion as to resist a gradual concentration of powers in the same branch, or even worse, unaccountable officials. Too often in recent history, we have seen wolves come as wolves. When unaccountable officials wield the prosecutorial power to weaponize the law, wolves come as wolves. Theodore Roosevelt, for his part, described the president as, quote, the steward of the people. That is exactly right. The executive branch exists to execute the law on behalf of the American people, not to insulate itself from them. This principle is especially important today because over the last several decades, parts of our government have gradually drifted away from the Constitution's original design. What began after Watergate as a prudential concern about political abuse slowly evolved into something much larger, a theory that portions of the executive branch should operate with independence from the elected president himself. Nowhere has that theory been more aggressively advanced than within, wait for it, the Department of Justice. You hear it constantly here in Washington. DOJ must remain independent. Prosecutors must be independent. Components must operate independently. The press has accused me of corrupting the entire department. If only I were that important. The phrase is so oft repeated that many people now assume it appears somewhere in the Constitution. Well, you all were kind enough to provide me with a Constitution this morning, so I took a look. It's not here. Nowhere is an independent Justice Department a feature of our Constitution. The Constitution creates three branches of government, not three branches plus a floating collection of federally funded philosopher kings. And yet, over time, a kind of cultural mythology developed inside parts of the executive branch, that institutional reliance and institutional resistance to a presidential direction was itself evidence of integrity, that resisting elected leadership demonstrated seriousness, that friction inside the executive branch was somehow synonymous with constitutional virtue. But it is not. The Department of Justice is not exempt from the Constitution's design. It is not some freestanding moral authority hovering above the democratic process. It is an executive department of the United States government, created by Congress, vested with enormous power, and accountable under Article 2 of the Constitution. That should not be controversial. But in modern Washington, somehow, it is. In 1789, the first Congress created the office of the Attorney General and United States attorneys. In 1870, Congress formally established the Department of Justice as an executive department under the leadership of the Attorney General, appointed by the President and answerable to him. Not answerable to editorial boards, not answerable to former officials writing open letters on LinkedIn, not answerable to cable news panels populated by people who suddenly rediscover constitutional theory every time Americans elect someone they dislike. The founders understood a simple truth. In our constitutional system, those entrusted with enforcing federal law ultimately remain accountable to the American people through their elected president. Congress reflected that principle when it established the Department of Justice as an executive department in 1870. That is not authoritarianism. That is how a constitutional republic functions. And frankly, the American people are tired of being told otherwise. For years, millions of Americans watched powerful institutions lecture them about norms while applying one standard to favored insiders and another to everyone else. They watched unelected officials behave as though disagreement with the political preference of the permanent bureaucracy was itself suspicious. They watched prosecutors and agencies increasingly act like independent political actors rather than constitutional officers. And then Washington seemed shocked when the public trust collapsed. Well, of course it collapsed. Trust disappears when Americans believe there are two systems of justice, one for ordinary citizens and another for the people who attend the right conferences, say the right things, and know the right people. The answer to that crisis is not less accountability, it's more. The answer is not a Justice Department insulated from our democracy. The answer is a Department of Justice disciplined by the Constitution. That means remembering that the President of the United States is elected by the people, for the people, and to set lawful executive priorities. When the American people vote for border security, the executive branch is supposed to pursue border security. When the American people vote to dismantle violent transnational gangs and cartels, the Department of Justice is supposed to help dismantle violent transnational gangs and cartels. When the American people vote to restore public safety to communities abandoned by soft-on-crime ideology, the department is supposed to aggressively pursue violent criminals, traffickers, and repeat offenders. Elections are not academic exercises. Elections have consequences. And one of those consequences is that the executive branch follows the lawful priorities of the elected president, not the personal policy preferences of insulated bureaucracies that have convinced themselves they answer to nobody. That is not radical. That is the Constitution of these United States. Now, let me be clear about another matter. None of this means the Department of Justice should become a political operation in the cheap partisan sense. The Constitution does impose limits. The law imposes limits. Prosecutors have ethical obligations. Courts exercise review. Congress conducts oversight. But constitutional accountability and professional restraint are not opposites. In fact, they depend on one another. The real danger is not that the president sets lawful priorities for the executive branch. The real danger is when unelected officials begin convincing themselves they are entitled to ignore, delay, frustrate, or quietly sabotage those priorities because they believe they know better than voters. That is not neutrality. That is bureaucratic supremacy dressed up as virtue. My friends, Americans are done tolerating it. For too long, parts of the federal government operated under the assumption that resisting elected leadership was somehow noble, that leaking was courage, that obstruction was integrity, and that substituting institutional preference for democratic accountability made someone a guardian of the republic. No, friends, it made them unaccountable. The framers separated powers between branches of government. They did not create permanent internal resistance movements inside the executive branch itself. The president is vested with executive power, not partial executive power, not conditional executive power subject to approval from anonymous officials 3 layers deep in bureaucracy. Executive power. And that principle matters enormously at the Department of Justice because the department possesses some of the most powerful authorities entrusted to government anywhere in the world. Federal prosecutors can destroy reputations, bankrupt families, alter elections, and deprive citizens of their liberty. Robert Jackson warned about this decades ago when he said, "The prosecutor has more control over life, liberty, and reputation than any other person in America." With that power must come humility. It requires discipline. And above all, it requires accountability. Because when prosecutorial power becomes untethered from constitutional structure, public trust evaporates. Americans watched federal law enforcement increasingly drift into what looked like and felt like politics. They watched extraordinary investigative tactics become normalized. They watched selective outrage become institutionalized. They watched some cases pursued with breathtaking aggression while others mysteriously stalled, narrowed, or disappeared altogether. And whether every individual decision was technically defensible misses the larger point. The point is that millions of Americans lost faith that equal justice under law actually meant equal justice under law. That is a crisis for any republic. And restoring that trust requires more than slogans. It requires a return to constitutional first principles. That is why this administration has focused on restoring clarity, discipline, and democratic accountability across the executive branch. At this Justice Department, that means aligning the department around priorities the American people actually voted for. Securing the border, dismantling transnational criminal organizations, combating violent crime, protecting our children, stopping fraud against taxpayers, and restoring safety and order to American communities. Not chasing headlines, not performing for social media applause from Georgetown dinner parties, and not confusing press coverage with constitutional legitimacy. That commitment to constitutional accountability also means something else: protecting the integrity of the legal profession itself from political capture. Recently, the department acted on precisely that principle when we filed a complaint concerning the conduct of the D.C. Bar's disciplinary apparatus and its treatment of administration officials and attorneys associated with the president of this administration. Because the practice of law cannot become a system where one's professional standing depends on alignment with the political preferences of elite legal culture here in D.C. That is not an independent bar. That is ideological enforcement masquerading as ethics. Law licenses are not meant to function as political weapons. Bar complaints are not supposed to become opposition research with CLE credits attached. And if we allow disciplinary systems to become vehicles for factional warfare, we do not strengthen the rule of law, we corrode it. A constitutional system depends on lawyers willing to represent unpopular clients, defend contested positions, and serve administrations that half the country may oppose at any given moment. John Adams knew this. You all know he defended British soldiers after the Boston Massacre. Robert Jackson represented the United States at Nuremberg after serving as Attorney General and Solicitor General. Some of the greatest legal advocates in our history took positions that subjected them to intense criticism in the moment. That is not a flaw in our system. It is evidence that our system is functioning. The moment lawyers begin facing professional destruction simply for serving a lawful administration or advancing lawful constitutional arguments, the legal profession stops being independent in any meaningful sense. It becomes political enforcement. I think many Americans instinctively understand that something unhealthy has developed in portions of elite institutional culture over the last several years. Too many institutions stopped viewing ideological diversity as tolerable. Too many powerful people became convinced disagreement itself was dangerous. Too many organizations that claimed neutrality increasingly acted like political actors while demanding immunity from criticism because they carried institutional titles. The American people rejected that mentality in November of 24, not because they oppose institutions, but because they want institutions that remember whom they serve. And that brings us back to the central point of today's conference. The Constitution is not self-executing. It depends on public officials with enough confidence to exercise lawful authority and enough humility to remain within lawful limits. It depends on judges willing to interpret the law rather than rewrite it. It depends on Congress willing to legislate rather than outsource difficult decisions to agencies. And it depends on an executive branch willing to act like an executive branch again, not apologetically, not timidly, and not as though exercising constitutionally vested executive authority is somehow illegitimate simply because modern Washington grew uncomfortable with constitutional accountability. Theodore Roosevelt once said, and yes, this is now my second Teddy Roosevelt quote, which means that some of my colleagues have won an office pool. Teddy Roosevelt said, "The first requisite of a good citizen in this republic of ours is that he shall be able and willing to pull his own weight." That is also true of institutions. Every branch must pull its constitutional weight. Every officer must fulfill his constitutional role, and every department, including this Department of Justice, must operate within the structure the framers gave us, not the structure modern bureaucratic culture wishes it had. And that ultimately is why gatherings like this matter. Because the debates you are having today are not abstract academic exercises. They are not law review hypotheticals disconnected from reality. They go directly to whether constitutional self-government remains possible in the modern administrative state. I ask you, can the American people still meaningfully direct their government through elections? Can elected officials actually implement the policies they campaigned on? Can constitutional accountability survive in a system increasingly dominated by permanent institutions, insulated expertise, and bureaucratic inertia? Those are no longer theoretical questions. They are defining governance questions of our time. And I believe the American people answered them loudly when they voted for Donald Trump. They voted for borders. They voted for law and order. They voted against selective enforcement and weaponized institutions. They voted against a governing culture that increasingly treated ordinary Americans as obstacles to be managed rather than citizens to be served. And they voted for an executive branch willing to govern again. That does not mean every exercise of executive power will be popular. It does not mean every legal controversy disappears. Our constitutional system was designed to produce conflict between branches. That is healthy. But what cannot continue is the notion that democratic legitimacy itself becomes suspect whenever the voters choose leaders that permanent governing class dislikes. That mindset is profoundly corrosive in our Republican government, because eventually people begin asking a very simple question. If the people we elect are not actually permitted to govern, then who is? The Constitution answers that question clearly. The president governs the executive branch. Congress writes the laws. Courts interpret the law. And each branch remains accountable within its constitutional sphere. That structure protects liberty because it makes power visible. Visible power can be checked. Visible power can be debated. Visible power can be removed through elections. But diffused, hidden, unaccountable power, meaning power exercised through institutional culture, bureaucratic resistance, selective enforcement, and informal networks, is far more dangerous precisely because no one claims responsibility for it. The founders understood that danger all too well. That is why they gave us separation of powers instead of government by managerial consensus. And that is why fidelity to the constitutional structure matters so much more today. Not because structure is academic, not because structure is elegant, but because structure is what preserves freedom when political passions run high. So to all of you participating in this summit today, lawyers, scholars, judges, policymakers, students, the press, I would simply say this: do not allow constitutional clarity to be bullied into ambiguity. Do not confuse institutional prestige with constitutional legitimacy. And do not let anyone convince you that democratic accountability is somehow incompatible with the rule of law. It is the rule of law, properly understood, that makes accountability possible. The Department of Justice does not exist to operate as an independent political actor. It exists to faithfully execute the laws of the United States under the Constitution. That is our only role, and it is our duty. And that is exactly what this administration intends to do. Thank you all very much. God bless you. God bless these United States of America.
Wow, that was a really fascinating speech. I'm probably going to rewatch that one to make sure I caught everything. Thank you again, Associate Attorney General Woodward, for coming and being here today. Thank you to all of you for coming to our inaugural Executive Branch Summit. My name is Eric Wesson, and I'll be introducing the moderator for the first panel. And hopefully you don't find it too grating, because I'll be introducing the moderator for every panel. So our first plenary session today is Executive Power in Action, a view of presidential priorities from Trump 45 and 47. A man after my own heart, the moderator, Aram Gavor, asked me to keep this short, so I will. Mr. Gavor is the Associate Dean of Academic Affairs at GW Law and is an internationally recognized public law scholar with a focus on regulation, technology, and national security. If you go to his FedSoc bio, you'll see he also has a ton of extremely impressive credentials all across government. So Mr. Gavor will take the panel and introduce the panelists, and I just want to remind everyone that at the conclusion of the panel, we'll have a 15-minute break and then are going to reconvene at 11 a.m. Thank you.
Thanks so much to the Society for scheduling and arranging this Executive Branch Summit. I'm Aram Gavor. Thanks so much. I would just love to invite the panelists to come up right now, and then I'll sit down and we can take it from there. So this first plenary for the inaugural Executive Branch Summit, titled Executive Power in Action, a View of Presidential Priorities from Trump 45 and 47, is a fitting way to begin this summit, because executive power is often discussed at a very high altitude: theory, doctrine, separation of powers, unitary executive, removal, deference, and the administrative state. And then it is also discussed, as you could see on news media, through specific adjudications, specific rules. So what we're going to talk about today is the strategic level of thinking and how presidential administration from the lens of agencies really works. That means we'll be discussing agency leadership, enforcement discretion, litigation positions, regulatory agendas, grant-making, reorganizations, personnel, and relationships with states and the regulated parties. So that's a lot within 90 minutes. The Constitution's structure, the executive branch, is not simply a policy delivery mechanism. Among his many significant powers, the president is elected to set and advance priorities. And it's the principal officers of the United States, like those sitting to the left of me, who operationalize those within the boundaries of the Constitution and their statutory authority. That is rule of law. This is particularly live after Loper Bright, Jarkissi, CASA, Axon, Arthrex, and a variety of other significant cases over the past years where there's broader renewed attention to whether agencies are acting within their proper authority within the constitutional system. In alphabetical order to my left, we're lucky to have Jonathan Berry. He is the Solicitor of Labor. In Trump 45, he served in the Department of Labor's policy leadership and also in the Justice Department's Office of Legal Policy. He now leads the Department of Labor's legal team at a moment when enforcement priorities, statutory text, and administrative adjudication are all front and center. David Fatuhi, second to my left, is the Deputy Administrator of the EPA. In Trump 45, he served as EPA's acting General Counsel and Principal Deputy General Counsel. He now sits at the center of EPA's work on agency reorganization, regulatory discipline, and stewardship of public funds. Andrea Lucas is the chair of the EEOC. In Trump 45, she was appointed by the president to the commission as a commissioner. In Trump 47, she is leading the agency. That change in role is quite significant to those who aren't inculcated in the particulars of those commissions and formerly independent agencies, at least so-called independent agencies. Stephen Vaden is the Deputy Secretary of Agriculture. In Trump 45, he served in senior leadership at USDA as its general counsel and then on the United States Court of International Trade as an Article III judge. He now leads USDA's operations, including questions of reorganization, rural proximity, regulatory reform, and program integrity. So we'll begin with opening remarks from each of the panelists and then move into a conversation about how presidential priorities become lawful, durable, and administrative agency action. Solicitor Berry.
Ram, thanks so much. It's great to see everyone this morning. So I think it is. I think it's common for conservatives, people who attend exactly this kind of programming, as I've done for too many years, to think about litigation as useful primarily for shaping doctrine, for challenging regulations, for directly changing public policy. This morning, I'd like to speak with you about the important work that the executive branch's lawyers do to assist President Trump in his constitutional duty, precisely to take care that the laws be faithfully enforced, and hopefully show something of a model in terms of enforcement priorities that track with the presidential priorities. My shorthand for this would be that yes, when it comes to litigation, holdings matter, doctrinal statements matter, but judgments matter even more, including against private bad actors who are subverting our laws. So in my role as solicitor, as general counsel and head of enforcement at the Department of Labor, I've announced my enforcement priorities precisely to carry out President Trump's instruction to put American workers first. We do that by shoring up the social contract that affirms work as service, service to God, service to family, service to community, and service to our nation. But work can't be service, not fully, if you are needlessly risking life or limb on the job. It can't be service, not fully, if your employer is holding back the fair wages you need to support those depending on you, or if stewards are faithless with your family's retirement savings or benefits promises. So in furtherance of putting the American worker first, pursuant to President Trump's instruction, what we're doing is we are focusing on the big, the bad, and the ugly, with apologies to Clint Eastwood, and I'm sincere about that because he's a very scary person. So when it comes to the big, we focus enforcement on matters that implicate really the largest number of workers possible to get as widespread relief as possible. And we're also paying special attention to employers whose respective position in their labor markets are potentially positioning them to facilitate employment law violations. With the bad, this is a special focus on willful and repeat violators who've demonstrated their refusal to comply with the law and therefore deserve maybe a little more or a lot more attention. This includes employers who have severely harmed workers. And in this vein, I am especially proud to support some pretty hard-hitting OSHA enforcement against egregious employer conduct. In just my 6 months as solicitor, we've issued actions against employers who have willfully and repeatedly exposed workers to grave risks, and in fact, to the death. We've had, these are cases involving workers being buried alive and asphyxiated or crushed, and workers who've been dragged into industrial-grade food processing machinery, which is pretty grim stuff. So that's the bad. And the ugly is my term for focusing on breaches of solemn trust by those who are obliged by law to put others before themselves. This is ERISA fiduciaries, this is union officials. And here we're following the express instruction of President Trump, who signed an executive order focusing on proxy advisors and their voting advice that supports illegal DEI or ESG practices. So our instruction from the president, which we are carrying out, is to strengthen the ERISA fiduciary and transparency rules as they apply to proxy advice. Now, that's the big, the bad, and the ugly. Sometimes I've had people on my team call it the good, the bad, and the ugly. So for the good, we're not focusing on enforcement. For the good, this is the vast majority of employers who want to color in the lines, but who are looking for guidance on exactly where those lines are. This is a special emphasis for us on compliance assistance. Acting Secretary Sonderling, in particular, has been emphatic about the importance of generating a high volume of high-quality guidance to regulated parties to better articulate where the rights and obligations of workers and employers really and truly lie. One thing I wanted to call out are instructions I've given to my lawyers on really the aftermath of Chevron. Now in the Loper-Bright era, I've instructed that it is crucial we enforce our statutes, our enforcement actions and regulations need to be anchored in statutory text. What is the agency actually authorized by Congress to do? A good example of this recently was our finalized rule on Title VI, where courts had previously determined that the statute, which has had an inferred or implied private right of action, did not encompass disparate impact. However, our regulations did contemplate that DOL could bring enforcement actions under a disparate impact theory. What Loper-Bright has permitted us to do, and we've now finalized rules to that effect, is to step back and say, okay, what's the actual single best reading of the statute, and bring ourselves into alignment with that. The last thing I wanted to share in the vein of further admin law geekery, but as a practical matter has really a lot of bite for certain agencies, is the scope and application and further application of the Jarkissi case, where recall in that just 2 years ago, the Supreme Court held that when the SEC in that case sought civil penalties for securities fraud, the Seventh Amendment required jury trial in front of an Article III court. The agency could not bring those claims in-house in front of an ALJ. So there are questions about kind of what fora are appropriate. These questions concern public rights versus private rights. Public rights are claims that are historically resolved outside of Article III courts because they involve the government, the executive sovereign functions. Think of like revenue collections, customs, relations with Indian tribes, and importantly, immigration. This is now something that we're dealing with. We're facing a variety of suits regarding DOL's authority to bring matters in front of administrative law judges, and the most mature one of these is a case that called U.S. Department of Labor versus Sun Valley Orchards, which the Supreme Court is going to be hearing presumably next term, coming out of the Third Circuit. This involves a case of an employer not giving agricultural guest workers, H-2A visa holders, what they were entitled to as part of the employer's agreement with the United States. That agreement, we've argued, that whole scheme implicates public rights because it concerns immigration. These are a system of visa conditions that employers have to abide by, ultimately for the sake of preventing American workers from being undercut by foreign workers. Third Circuit didn't see it that way, and we're grateful that the Supreme Court has now taken the cert petition. So that's one more example. Lots more to discuss, but it's wonderful to be with you this morning. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Solicitor Barry. Deputy Administrator Fatuhi.
Well, thank you, Aram. Good morning, everyone. Thank you to the Federalist Society for the invitation to be with you this morning. It's my honor to be back at EPA. As Aram said earlier, I served in the first term of the Trump administration for almost the entirety of the first term in the Office of General Counsel, and I'm pleased to be back now 11 months on the job as the Deputy Administrator. At the agency, we are working hard every day to show that you can protect human health and the environment while still supporting a thriving and robust economy and reducing the cost of living for average Americans. Unfortunately, when the team arrived in January of last year, we found an agency that was in no state to meet that lofty goal. We inherited an agency with a wasteful budget, record high staffing levels, and notwithstanding those staffing levels, record backlogs across the agency on actions such as Clean Air Act state implementation plans, pesticide and chemical reviews, small refinery exemptions, water quality standards, and the list goes on. We found taxpayer-funded grant programs that were cumulatively many times larger than the agency's entire annual budget that were being operated without a level of oversight that we would deem acceptable for a grant program of that size. Programs that were plagued by potential conflicts of interests and unqualified recipients. We also, to make matters worse, we also found an agency that had shifted away from its core mission towards implementing costly and unnecessary regulations, a focus on DEI and environmental justice, while trying to expand its own authority beyond what Congress had granted to it. And we also found an agency that had lost every Supreme Court case that the Biden administration faced during their 4 years in office. Examples of trying to defend the self-aggrandizing approach of the last administration. So needless to say, Administrator Zeldin and the team had our work cut out for us. So our first priority was to recommit the agency to being a better steward, the best steward of taxpayer dollars. That included terminating $29 billion worth of grant programs, including the $20 billion Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund and the $7 billion so-called Solar for All program, to align with congressional intent. Next, we turned our attention to making the agency leaner and more efficient through reorganization. Today, our headcount is down from a record high of over 17,000 employees to approximately 12,500 employees. And I want to emphasize that the vast majority of that change came from voluntary early retirements or deferred resignations. Our incredible staff is resilient, they care deeply about our statutory mission, and we are working hard to give them the tools that they need to work more efficiently and more effectively. We're proving that you can do more with less by putting the right people with the right skills in the right roles. Beyond reducing the size of our workforce, we've made strategic organizational changes to better support our staff and our stakeholders. We've created an Office of State Air Partnerships to reaffirm our commitment to cooperative federalism under the Clean Air Act. We've combined our Office of the Chief Financial Officer with our Office of Mission Support to bring together HR, finance, and IT functions under one organization to support our core mission. We folded in our Office of Science and Technology within the Office of Water into the other program offices within that office so that their work could be better used to inform actual policy and regulatory judgments. We've also changed the way the agency approaches scientific research. For too long, the standalone Office of Research and Development made its own priorities instead of supporting the priorities of our regulatory program offices, carrying out statutory work. While research and gold standard science remain at the heart of what we do, our scientists and researchers are now supporting our regulatory programs directly across the agency. To anchor that work, we've created a new Office of Applied Science and Environmental Solutions directly within the Administrator's Office, with hundreds of scientists conducting critical research on air, land, emergency management, water, chemicals, and pesticides. We're also returning the work of conducting risk assessments to our program offices instead of using the formerly one-size-fits-all IRIS program that was housed in the Office of Research and Development, never authorized by Congress, and that traditionally developed risk assessments that failed to take into account critical statutory and regulatory context and requirements. And thanks to the infusion of expertise in those program offices, especially in our Office of Chemical Safety, we've been able to reduce the backlog, as I mentioned, across the agency. In January 2025, for example, there were over 15,000 pesticide registration actions pending review that were considered late or overdue. By mid-May of this year, that number had fallen to 8,000, and we're continuing to make progress. In the new chemicals program, we saw a backlog that doubled under the last administration, and we've now been able to complete 500 new chemicals reviews since the beginning of last year. We've also nearly eliminated our backlog of 200 small refinery exemption petitions under the Renewable Fuel Standard program, and we're working hard to reduce other backlogs across the agency. After only the first 16 months, we are continuing to deliver historic results. We've delivered on the President's promise to unleash American energy independence and dominance to protect the American consumer and restore the rule of law. We're working hard to dismantle burdensome and unnecessary federal mandates and are executing on the Trump EPA's historic deregulatory agenda, including, most significantly, through the repeal of the 2009 Obama EPA endangerment finding for GHG emissions from motor vehicles and engines, an action by itself that will save $1.3 trillion of regulatory compliance costs and reduce the price of the average new motor vehicle by $2,400. Our work has just begun. We have just under 1,000 more days in this term, and we intend to use every one of those days to advance the goals of the American people and to prove that you don't have to choose between protecting the environment and growing our economy. Thank you again for the invitation to be with you this morning, and I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you, Deputy Administrator Fatuhi. Chair Lucas?
It's a pleasure to be with you all. I think most of you are familiar with the work of DOL and the EPA and USDA, but I think probably EEOC is a little less familiar, so I'll start briefly with defining what we are. In part, just in response to even our intro, the EEOC has never, not for decades, been an independent agency. That might be a shock to some of you, but the agency, in fact, has been an executive branch agency and has consistently taken that position internally and in consultation with the Department of Justice's Office of Legal Counsel, that we are, in fact, an executive branch agency. So the EEOC is the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. The words of that matter. Equal opportunity, not equal outcomes. So in the mission of the agency was this premise that we were supposed to actually be enforcing the law, that all people were created equal, and that no one categorically should be treated differently based on their race, their sex, national origin, color, religion, and a variety of additional protected characteristics that we enforce. But almost from the very beginning, the agency went off the rails. And so you had two visions of the agency. We were supposed to protect all workers from employment discrimination on those protected characteristics, not particular groups, but all workers on these protected characteristics. And the two visions of the agency from the start were, one, it could be led by Democrats who either mismanaged the agency, ignored it, bloated it, had raging backlogs of charges, or twisted it aggressively to expand beyond the scope of its regulatory powers, which were very limited. The agency had no ability to regulate Title VII, other than procedural regulations. It could not create the law, it could not interpret the law, it could only execute the law. And yet, immediately, the agency proceeded to try to grow and shape and expand the scope of Title VII. Or you could have a very libertarian view of the world, which is what many Republicans did. Not Justice Thomas, he was one of the great and amazing Republican chairs of the EEOC, but for many other Republicans, the answer was either to be a version of a Democrat, maybe a little weaker, but basically the same, a liberal Republican, or to be very libertarian. But unfortunately, libertarianism often just meant that you were a bed warmer for Democrats. You ignored the agency, you shrunk it, you gut it, but you did not take care to execute the laws. You did not rip out every inch of the regulations that were strangling the American worker, strangling workplaces, and twisting and warping civil rights law to be a perpetual one-way, lockstep, constant move to the left, to the left, to the left, to the left. And so I'm here to say that in the Trump administration, there is a third way, and we are doing it, and that is to effectively and aggressively enforce the law. And at the same time, while we're driving forward aggressive executive priorities of enforcing in a colorblind and even-handed manner the civil rights laws before us, we are also ripping down the regulations and the excesses of the agency where we have strayed outside of those laws. So that is the middle path that is set before us. This administration prioritizes law and order. We heard from Stanley Woodward about executing the law. That is the primary goal of the executive branch, actually to robustly use our enforcement powers. If we let civil rights law drift, then it will only be executed by one party, and that is wrong. Republicans can have priorities too. Republicans can have civil rights priorities too. We have them, and we are using them, and we are doing them. So what does it look like to have a conservative view of civil rights law? It is to be executing only within the inch, not an inch beyond the scope of what Congress gave us. So we will not be interpreting Title VII. We will not be expanding and twisting things into something that reshapes what Congress gave us. But we will absolutely enforce what Congress wrote. What Congress wrote was that all individuals were created equal under God. Back to the 250th anniversary of our nation, that matters, that every person should be judged solely on merit and what they can bring to the workplace and not on their skin color, not on their sex. That is a beautiful vision of our world, and it is one that absolutely the agency can enforce on. We are living up to the words of our name, that we'll enforce equal employment opportunity and not equal outcomes. So we are reducing and deprioritizing disparate impact, consistent with the president's executive order on that. We are focusing on intentional disparate treatment, intentional discrimination, and there's lots of that, right? And we see this in a whole host of areas. This has meant that we have widened the aperture of our work. It has not narrowed it. There have been a variety of critiques of the administration's civil rights work, that we are only prioritizing white men, that we are only focusing on conservative Christians. And to that I say no, but we are also saying that those individuals will not be ignored. We are going to work on behalf of every single worker, black or white, Hispanic, Asian, male, female, but we're not going to say that the civil rights are only for certain groups, historically underrepresented minorities, women. You pick whatever the left's priority groups were. We are not going to say that civil rights laws are only for them. They are also for white men. And they always have been. And in fact, the agency, in some of the glimmers of what it has done good at various points, early in the 60s and 70s, even before the Supreme Court took positions on this, did acknowledge that the words that Congress had written covered white men and white individuals, as well as black workers and women, and again, any worker of any race or any set of both sexes. So we did something right there, but we did not acknowledge it loudly. We did not educate workers to that effect. So over the last decades, we have in fact recovered millions, tens of millions, possibly hundreds of millions if you sum it all up, for men and for white individuals and for combinations thereof. But in terms of how we messaged that, what we wrote, what we spoke about, the enforcement priorities that were announced, the public messaging that we did, the educational campaigns that we did, and the lawsuits and the public conciliations that we had, right? Those speak to strategic priorities. Those tell people about whether or not you are in fact welcome. If the agency enforces the law even-handedly, but only silently in the dark, right? It's like if a tree falls in the forest and no one hears it, was it an enforcement priority? Probably not. Will people actually know that someone has rights? I would say no. And so we're trying very hard to adjust that. One example of this, in the race discrimination space, right? Part of what we have been prioritizing, focusing on, is attacking unlawful race and sex discrimination that has manifested itself in the euphemism of DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. So that form of discrimination often has manifested in the form of intersectional race and sex discrimination against white men. So, like I said, the agency has recovered confidentially millions of dollars for white individuals, for male individuals, and for white men. But over the last 10 years, just as a snippet, the agency has brought 1,400 lawsuits. We receive hundreds of millions of charges over that period of time. Only a small portion of them turn into lawsuits. About 100 of them a year are a lawsuit. So over that average period, 1,400 lawsuits. How many lawsuits did we bring for race and sex discrimination on behalf of a white man in that time? 0. Up until earlier this month, when we filed a lawsuit against the New York Times on behalf of a white man for race and sex discrimination. So again, our critics say, you are politicizing the agency by doing that. How dare you? How could you do this? You're only prioritizing white men. And I've been saying, no, by filing one lawsuit, over 1,400 lawsuits over 10 years on behalf of a white man, we are only finally working to correct a gross under-enforcement of the law in this space. So that won't be the last of the lawsuits. There are more coming. There will be more because we are prioritizing even-handed enforcement on behalf of all individuals. But we will no longer let there be a misimpression that the laws are only for some races and only for one sex. The law is for everyone. No one should be judged basis on the race and sex. So far, again, we are bringing lawsuits like that. We are recovering millions so far for a variety of workers, including workers who have historically been told by the civil rights activists that they are not covered. $500,000 for white employees who suffered DEI-related race and sex discrimination against Planned Parenthood, a lawsuit against New York Times. We're investigating through subpoena enforcement actions, Nike, Northwestern Mutual, out in public on that. $500,000 for an Asian man who was told that he was not diverse enough, as well as too old, in writing by an HR manager who accidentally copied him. That's just a snippet of what we're doing on DEI. On religious liberty, there too, again, we're enforcing the law on behalf of Christians and Muslims and Jews and workers of every religion. $63 million in 15 months, which is the largest amount the agency has ever recovered for religious liberty in its 60-year history. The most robust anti-Semitism work that we have ever done, from a $21 million settlement against Columbia University to multiple subpoena enforcement actions and against leading Ivy League institutions, and investigations that have led to the Department of Justice being able to sue the University of California for this work. A national origin work on behalf of Americans, including a lawsuit just this past week on behalf of Americans in New Mexico who were mocked for speaking English, again, in the United States, and for being American. All of this work is happening, and it's happening alongside of bread and butter and historic forms of and traditional patterns of discrimination. So a robust reorientation of the administration's priorities while also serving all of the other workers that we have also done. The law can, in fact, be colorblind, and it results in more workers having more rights.
Thank you, Chair Lucas. Last but not least, Deputy Secretary Vaden, who I must also add taught me everything I know about the Packers and Stockyards Act of 1921.
Well, thank you, Aaron. That's quite an accomplishment on my part. You know, you led out in your opening remarks, Aaron, by pointing out what a unique opportunity this is. We have a president for only the second time in American history who is serving non-successive terms in office. And while unique, it offers a unique set of opportunities, and it's largely because of the appointments that the president made in his first term and the reappointments that he has made in his second term that are represented across this table. Because lessons have been learned, and the American people have had a very unique opportunity in the most recent presidential election to judge not two sets of promises, not one record versus one set of promises, but two records against one another and choose that they prefer best and ask that it be implemented. And so at USDA, what we are doing is seeking to take that charge, continue the work that we began in the first administration, double down on it, and ensure that it is enduring. In the president's first term, USDA was the only cabinet agency to successfully carry out a relocation of entire agencies outside of the Washington, D.C. area. We took our Economics Research Service, we took our National Institute of Food and Agriculture, and we moved them to Kansas City, Missouri, much closer to the land-grant universities in rural America that they serve. In his second term, we've thought larger. We at USDA serve rural America. You don't have to be that familiar with the National Capital Region to realize there's not a lot of rural around here. So what are we doing here with thousands and thousands of employees sitting in buildings that, despite the fact that we have thousands of employees, are at times more than 60% vacant and have literally billions of dollars worth of backlog maintenance sitting on the taxpayer's dime? So what we have decided to do is take more than half of the remaining employees that we have here in the National Capital Region and move them out much closer to rural America, into locations that you, the taxpayer, have paid for years, that are nicer than the facilities we have here in Washington, D.C., and to the benefit of our employees, they have much lower costs of living and commutes that average 20 minutes rather than an hour one way. That's why we're moving our employees to Raleigh, North Carolina, Indianapolis, Indiana, Fort Collins, Colorado, once again even more to Kansas City, Missouri, and Kansas, and Salt Lake City. It makes perfect sense because these are closer to the communities we serve. Let me give one prominent example. USDA contains the Forest Service. The Forest Service manages huge swaths of land across this country, but 90% of it is west of the Mississippi River. You wouldn't know that, judging by the fact that we have an entire building here on the National Mall known as the Yates Building. It's next to the Holocaust Museum, that is full of Forest Service bureaucrats who manage lands that are located nowhere near here. By the end of this year, the Forest Service will have a new headquarters. It will be in Salt Lake City, Utah, in the Bennett Federal Building, which was renovated by the previous administration, despite the fact that it sat empty for that entire federal administration. This isn't a one-story building in Salt Lake. It's a multi-story high-rise in which USDA is the primary tenant. And by the end of this year, the chief of the Forest Service and all of his key officials will be relocated to Salt Lake City, where they will manage much closer to the actual lands that the Congress has charged them with overseeing, at a gigantic savings to the taxpayers, and not to mention the ability to use the Salt Lake City airport to fight the forest fires that unfortunately continue to haunt us out west. Second, during what I refer to as the interregnum, there were a lot of great Supreme Court decisions which confirmed that actions this administration had taken in its first term were indeed a proper view of the law. Key among them were Loper-Bright, which confirmed that it's the text of the statute that matters, nothing else, and a case known as 7 Counties, which, though coming in the form of a NEPA case, actually I think has much broader implications, because contained within 7 Counties is a discussion and a holding that sounds common sense, but actually was one of the favorite tricks of judges who like to pretend they're agency administrators to strike down actions taken by Republican officials when they are in office. And that is the cute little game of someone submits a comment about a topic that you, the agency, have absolutely no authority to do something about whatsoever, and the judge finds that you didn't respond to that comment because you have no authority to take any action whatsoever, and therefore your rulemaking proceeding is defective, and they throw it out. It happens all the time, but in the Supreme Court made the monumental decision that if you don't have anything to say or any power to act in a particular area, you don't have to respond to comments about that because it would be a waste of your time. Monumental, I know, but it took the Supreme Court to tell the rest of the federal judiciary that. That's why we have them. So at USDA, we're engaging in substantial regulatory reform, and we started out with NEPA, stripping out layers of regulations that have accreted over time and have resulted in the fact that if you want to have a new mine in this country that is located on Forest Service land, you know what the average time from proposal to actually you're getting a permit and being able to stick a shovel in the ground and start digging is? 20 years. 20 years. You want to know why we don't have critical minerals? You want to know why we have all these supply chain issues? Because we made it impossible to dig what we already have out of the ground. Now, thanks to the regulations we have put in place, the most stringent environmental assessment that we're required to do under the law, a so-called environmental impact statement, will be done at a maximum in 2 years. Not 20 years, 2 years. And it will have page limits, and thanks to the Supreme Court, you'll no longer have to think about every possible thing that could happen that might even be someone else's responsibility and write a paragraph about it. With regard to line speeds, that's another area where we're taking advantage. What am I talking about with line speeds? Well, all of you eat protein, or at least you should if you've taken a look at our new dietary guidelines that we issued not that long ago. It's the foundation of every meal. But believe it or not, in this country, whether you like pork or poultry, there are currently limits on how many of those carcasses can make their way down the assembly line within a given time. That's a fancy way of saying we have production limits in this country when it comes to food. There has been, at this point, a nearly 15-year odyssey to undo this. Every time struck down on the grounds of, wait for it, not food safety, which is what USDA is charged with actually administering, but instead concerns about worker safety, which we have nothing to do with, but John Barry has a lot to say about over there at the Department of Labor. And so in the president's first term, we put reforms into place. A Democrat-appointed district judge in the state of Minnesota, where else, decided to strike it down on the grounds that we had not taken worker safety into account, even though at the time, when I was general counsel, I was literally the one who wrote this in the regulation. I put it in there, we don't have a responsibility for worker safety, therefore, we don't have any comment about it because we have no authority to do anything. Thanks to 7 counties, we're going to give that same answer the second time around, and it's going to stick. And then finally, Loper Bribe. In USDA, we have a wealth of authorities that affect landowners across this country, including, believe it or not, about wetland determinations. USDA was charged with making certain determinations regarding farmers' land in a farm bill that passed during the Reagan administration. Up until 1996, that's about 10 years from the passage of that original piece of legislation requiring these determinations, USDA made determinations in a certain way and gave farmers what should have been confidence that their lands either did or did not have wetlands. Makes a big deal because under the law that was passed in the mid-'80s, if you convert a wetland to an agricultural purpose, you are forever barred from accessing USDA programs, including our safety net programs. When environmentalism rose in Democrat administrations, they spent their time playing around with these determinations, creating uncertainty. Literally decades of policy accretion have ignored the plain text of the statute, and indeed I think the agency itself forgot what the statute actually said after so many different policies have gone back and forth. We're going to be engaged in a rulemaking proceeding which will be blissfully short, because really all we have to do, thanks to Loper Bribe, is forget about all these accretions which paid no attention to the law Congress actually passed in the mid-1980s and then amended in the mid-1990s because they quite correctly did not like what the Clinton administration was up to in the first 2 years of its initial term in office. And we're literally going to say, here are all of the mistakes that this department has made over 30 years, none of which have been based in anything you can find in the statute book. And instead, we're going back to the plain words of the statute. We're going to follow that. And if you're a farmer and you've got a wetland determination from us, you can bank on it because it's final. And the only way it will ever be called into question is exactly when the statute says it will be, if you come to us and say you want a new one. This doesn't sound revolutionary, but because of how the federal government has been run the past 50 years, it truly is. And that brings us to the third point of what we're focusing on at USDA. Americans have rightly become cynical when it comes to how their government has been run. We have a multi-trillion-dollar federal deficit that only grows larger by the minute. And unfortunately, a large part of those expenditures didn't have to happen. And I'm not just saying that because I disagree with the policy decisions that were made. I'm saying that because they were the result of actual fraud. This administration has a task force that is focused on eliminating fraud, and we at USDA are playing an important role because of a host of programs we run, most notably the food stamp program. The food stamp program is supposed to represent what is best about America. We help those who truly need a helping hand, thanks to the generosity of the American taxpayer. Unfortunately, it has turned, over years, into a racket that is rife with fraud. Let's start out with a number that everybody agrees on, because it's a published statistic by the previous administration. The food stamp program is a 12-figure program a year. I had to count them to make sure I got that right. That's more than $100 billion of your taxpayer money go out every year in the food stamp program. Right off the reel, 1 out of every 10 of those dollars, 10%, $10 billion, is misspent. That's the error rate. Error rates vary widely between states, but for example, in the state of New Jersey, perhaps it will surprise you to know, perhaps it won't, they have an error rate of more than 30%. That means 1 out of every $3 they spend by their own accounting is incorrect. There is one of our states in the union that has an error rate of more than 50%. They would literally do a better job administering the program if they did eligibility by flipping a coin. They can't beat that. But that's the error rate. That's not the fraud rate. Fraud comes on top of that. What we did is we asked for all of the states of the union to give us their data so we could run it through databases and determine how well the program was being run. 29 states gave us their data. The remainder, 21, are fighting us in federal court to keep us from getting that data on the grounds that they believe there is no fraud. And of course, there's no better way to prove that you have nothing to hide than to go to federal court in an effort to hide it. But for the 29 states, most of which are red, but I will give credit, some of them are blue. North Carolina's governor is a Democrat. Kansas's governor is a Democrat. They've given us their data. We have found some interesting information. We have discovered that in the 29 states that we have, 186,000 people the Social Security Administration informs us are dead are receiving SNAP benefits. We have found another nearly 400,000 people the Social Security Administration informs us their Social Security numbers have never been given to a person in this country are receiving SNAP benefits. We have found, and keep in mind, we don't have all 50 states, we only have 29, that there are hundreds of thousands of more people who are simultaneously receiving benefits in multiple states. There's one high achiever that among the 29 states that we have is simultaneously receiving benefits from 6 different states. 6. And here's another fun fact. Won't surprise you to know that we don't have the data from New York State. They're suing us. New York is one of the states, like California and like Minnesota, see a pattern here, that are run at the county level, not the state level. New York City, every borough is a different county. Manhattan is New York County. Bronx is Kings County. Queens is Queens County. Staten Island is Richmond County. Each of those counties has a separate SNAP program. And that's before you add New Jersey with its more than 30% error rate and Connecticut on opposite sides of the metropolitan area. We have none of those states' data. Imagine how many dual beneficiaries we've got going along there. This is only one of our programs, but among the 29 states whose data we have found multiple billions of dollars worth of fraud, on top of the $10 billion a year error rate. This is unacceptable. This is why the people who elected this administration and who expected to carry out its mandate have for so long felt cynical about the federal government, because it seems as though those who do best are those who break the rules, and those who do what everyone should, which is work for a living and save their money for a rainy day, appear to be fools in such a system. But this is also why I chose to step down from the judiciary and be an honest person, and if I wanted to play politics, not wear a robe, but come into the executive branch where you could, because this is a way we can make a difference. We can cut that cynicism out by having federal agencies that are closer to the people they serve while respecting the budgets that Congress pass, following the statutes that Congress pass when we enact regulations, and cutting out spending billions of dollars to people who are stealing your hard-earned money. And I'm proud to be a part of a team that's taking care of it and doing it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Deputy Secretary Vaden. So there's been a lot of discussion here to date in this little bit of time that we've had. I've taken a lot of notes, and I think that there's been a significant change in what was originally understood to be traditionally navigable presidential administration, law, policy, and operations. And your administrative law nerds out there, I hope you caught the little traditional navigable piece. I'm going to start with a general question for the whole group that they can answer if they wish, free form, and then get into a couple specific questions for each of the discussants. And then we'll wrap up with some Q&A time. So my one general question is, you all have the distinction, honor, and privilege of serving in Trump 45 and Trump 47. So each of you has experience across both. What's different this time in the machinery of government? Solicitor Barry?
So I would point out two things that are different this time around. One is, in my view, the level of responsiveness of the civil service, and I think what that relates to specifically, a big piece of that is instead of there was a lot of civil service reform that was commenced towards the end of the first term, but those in fact framed the beginning of the second term. You have a series of reforms in place being driven that are, I think, that have resulted in positioning the many more people who are still the ones who remain within the civil service to actually be responsive to the politically accountable leadership of the agencies. That is a major difference. I think the other one that comes to my mind is I think there's been an intensification of focus, of an understanding of what it is that we are here for. And I can again point to nothing better than the incredible amount of executive activity flowing from President Trump's pen. Think back to the Staff Secretary Will Scharf, sharing all of those executive orders, announcing those, and the President signing those. That was just an explosion of activity to kick off the term. I am not tired of winning. I'm a little bit dizzy, but in the best possible way. So there's a level of new layer of thoughtfulness and coherence that kick things off, and that I think is helping all of us focus more intentionally on the mission.
Thank you. Deputy Administrator Fatuhi?
Yeah, I'll just say to that, we accomplished a significant amount at EPA in the first term of the Trump administration, but what I think is different about this term, and I think it partly goes back to, Stephen, your comment about the interregnum, right? You've got, one of the silver linings of having two non-sequential terms is that there was a period of time to sit back and reflect and consider what went well, what didn't go as well, and how to hit the ground running on day one. And it does feel as though we hit the ground running on day one through the executive orders and then implementation of those executive orders. I think there's also a change in terms of we're simply aiming higher, because we know that we have better Supreme Court precedent to help with our deregulatory actions. We talked a bit about Loper-Bright, but also it's at least significant in my space is the West Virginia against EPA case. Obviously, folks know that most commonly because it sort of put a bow around the concept of major questions. It didn't announce the major questions doctrine because that doctrine had been built up over years in different cases, but it really sort of crystallized the concept of when an agency action implicates the major questions doctrine. And in the case of West Virginia, that was based on our repeal in the first term of the Obama-era Clean Power Plan that sought to regulate greenhouse gas emissions from existing coal and gas-fired power plants through a generation-shifting structure that went well outside of EPA's authority to regulate emissions and instead put us in the role of being an energy regulator and a grid dispatcher. And so I think that case, combined with other cases, Loper-Bright, the Sackett case, getting back to your traditional navigable waters reference, we know that we have more receptive case law that encourages the agency to look at the best reading of the statute and to think twice before enacting regulatory authority that's never been used before to carry, or rather to aggrandize regulatory power over vast swaths of the economy. We are looking across the board at our regulatory landscape that's built up over years, including in the Biden administration, where you saw attempts to revise and rescind many of the actions that we took in the first term of the Trump administration at EPA, and in many examples make them even broader, even more expansive, even more onerous, even more costly, with the net effect of raising the price of everything: consumer goods, groceries, electricity, gas, the price of vehicles. The rules that we promulgate have a direct effect on the cost of living of every American. And so we're aiming high, we hit the ground running, and we've got a lot more ground to cover, but we're really proud of what we've accomplished in the first 16 months.
Thank you. Chair Lucas?
Yeah, I think that, it's important to think about what the first Trump administration had in terms of the structure of the commission, for at least for the EEOC, and the difference that you can see in the prioritization of civil rights here. Again, I think the first administration, the difference is we're thinking much bigger, like David said, and faster, and so you can see that. So in the first Trump administration, there was not a confirmed Republican chair until May of 2019, so 2.5 years into the first term. And there wasn't a Republican majority until the last 3 months of the Trump administration. So I came in I was confirmed in September of 2020 and came in October of 2020, and had another Republican colleague, now acting Secretary of Labor Keith Sonderling, paired with the Republican chair then, Janet Dillon. And so you've got 3 months basically to do everything you wanted to do, and only 1 month of that is before the election. It was just we got a lot done in 3 months, but at 3 months versus 4 years is a radical difference. And prior to that point, prior to even having a Republican chair, where you have a Democrat majority and you have a Obama Republican in an acting role at the agency, it's a very fundamentally different ability to wield the power of the executive branch through that agency. Now, we have the president took decisive action to fire 2 of my Democrat colleagues, which was completely, again, within his power based on the statute and based on, the executive nature of the agency. And you have a Republican chair right away, and you have now a majority within the first year. So we're able to just do a lot more, much more quickly. And paired with that, you have 11 different executive orders just about the EEOC itself. Right, lots and lots of immediate, within the first day and week of the administration, specifically charging the agency to carry out a whole host of civil rights priorities. Very different than prior Republican administrations, even the first term.
Thank you. Deputy Secretary Vaden.
Well, I would build off on what my colleagues laid out. Those 4 years of the interregnum, though they were depressing, they were valuable. And one of the reasons why they were most valuable was we saw in the previous administration what could be accomplished if your goal was to ignore the law and you linked arms and sought to have a whole of government approach to that. And we're doing the opposite here. We're linking arms across cabinet agencies and seeking to follow the law and carry out the mandate that the president was duly elected for. To pick up on Chair Lucas's theme, the prior administration, their focus on trying to base everything on race was probably not matched by any other president since the previous Democratic president, Woodrow Wilson, in terms of trying to segregate everything. At USDA, we shamefully paid out disaster relief benefits to farmers who had suffered natural disasters like drought based on race. If you were a black farmer, if you were a female farmer, you got more than the farmer next door who had a different demographic characteristic. You suffered from the same drought, you suffered from the same harm, but because of the color of your skin or which gender you were, you got a different payment. That's unconstitutional, and yet the government linked arms across the board in seeking to carry out that agenda. This administration took note of that, and we have linked arms in seeking to abide by the Constitution. Strip down those racist programs that made distinctions on citizens based on traits that don't matter. We have linked arms when it comes to, for example, helping American farmers. I credit David and his department for the excellent rule they recently issued on biofuels, the most pro-biofuels rule ever issued by any administration of either party. And that's the Solicitor General of Iowa right there. Good job. And when it comes to anything that we face, whether it be input costs, affordability, or regulatory policy, no one agency has a monopoly on it. But because we have people who have been there before, who have pre-existing friendships, and who are aligned, instead of spending our time in palace intrigue behind the scenes, as is so common here in Washington, D.C., we get together, we see how we can use our different authorities to help each other's constituencies and move this country forward. And that is what have the people who dislike this president so worried. They are seeing a team of people who are competent and who are united and who are executing. And it's made possible by the fact that we had 4 long years to think about it.
Thank you. So now I'll ask maybe 1 or 2 rounds of substantive questions of each of the discussants. So, Solicitor Berry, rules, adjudications, reorganizations, enforcement, those are typically the tools of the executive branch agencies in the absence of statutory change. You have a lot of expertise, especially in the context of durability and causing durable change. What have you done and what have you seen that can really lead to a longer effect, behavioral change effect, for administration policy?
So I would point it to 2 things. One is really that importance of anchoring our work in the best interpretation of the original public meaning of the statutes that we have. That has, as it should. This is the whole shooting match. This is how our system of separated powers works. That if we can put forward that best possible interpretation, that has an incredible anchoring effect because it draws executive activity back to the law that the president is faithfully is charged to take care with. I think the second thing I would point to is I said in my opening statement that holdings matter and judgments matter even more, and that there is in our space, one of the things that we are centrally concerned with is making sure that our labor markets stay bounded, that we enforce a variety of minimum labor standards meant to ensure that employers are not getting unfair competitive advantages by exploiting or abusing their workers in illegal ways, and taking action to enforce those, especially against those laws, especially against the big, the bad, and the ugly, being serious about that is extremely valuable. If employers know that there is a serious threat of enforcement action, if every time we take a major action, you expect to see there's a lot of law firm client alerts that go out, and any serious employer is going to have outside and inside counsel, HR departments that's going to be reading those things and paying attention to those headlines and to those alerts, and that shapes behavior in a lot of ways, large and small, that can endure from administration to administration.
Thank you. Deputy Administrator Fatuhi, your comments today and your remarks touch on a lot of subjects, but one of the through lines that I see is deregulation. That word can obscure more than it reveals, naturally, especially outside of the Beltway. But how do you distinguish deregulation from simply better regulation? And what does that look like for EPA's statutory missions to remain true to the protection of air, water, land, and human health?
It's something we think about every day. The regulatory landscape of the agency is built up over decades, and so you've got layer upon layer of gloss in the CFR, imposing requirement after requirement on industry sectors across the country, on landowners, on farmers, on manufacturers. And it's gotten to the point where tens of thousands of dollars of the price of a new home are due to regulatory costs. Thousands of dollars of the price of a motor vehicle are due to regulatory costs. And some of those, of course, are necessary. We have statutes that we're responsible for carrying out. Those statutes call upon the agency to execute them through developing regulations, and regulations that are designed well provide clear instructions and directives to the regulated community about what's expected and what's required. Many of our statutes include the potential for criminal penalties, so they need to be clearly described so that folks understand what obligations they are responsible for following. What we saw in the last administration in particular, but it began in the Obama administration, was using a broad swath of authorities at the agency to go after disfavored industries. For example, coal-fired power generation. The Obama administration and subsequently the Biden administration used Clean Air Act Authority, but also Clean Water Act Authority, Resource Conservation and Recovery Act Authority, that's the statute that deals with solid and hazardous waste, and developed a set of regulatory requirements that, layered on top of one another, made it essentially too costly to operate a facility. I'll give you an example of an action we recently took. We repealed the Biden EPA's amendments to what are called the mercury and air toxics standards. These are standards that were first set in 2012. They govern emission of mercury and other what are called air toxics from coal-fired power plants. In 2020, we reviewed that rule under a required 8-year review and determined that the rule was adequately protective of human health with a margin of safety. The Biden EPA looked at that again in 2024 and essentially reached the same conclusion as to the human health protectiveness of those 2012 standards that facilities were essentially fully adopting and in compliance with. And just to give you some context, in the last 15 or 20 years, mercury emissions from power plants have fallen by over 90%. Air toxics emissions from power plants have fallen by over 80%. They reached a conclusion that the existing regulations adequately protected human health, but they then contorted the Clean Air Act to say, but because we can find that there are additional technologies available to reduce those emissions even further, we have authority to impose them at the cost of another $670 million that are not necessary to protect human health, but we will impose them nonetheless because we have the authority to do it. We've repealed that rule. And interestingly, when I flew to Louisville, Kentucky to a power plant to announce our final action on the repeal, I did a press conference and one of the reporters asked, well, $670 million, that's not very much money. That's about the annual budget of the city of Louisville, or less than the annual budget of the city of Louisville. That doesn't seem like very much. Why are you doing that? Well, first of all, we didn't have the authority to impose it to begin with. Second, $670 million across a number of power generation facilities is a significant amount of money. It does increase the cost of generating baseload power, which we need more of by the day, and it increases and it results in a destabilized grid and increased electric prices. So we're seeing that across our regulatory landscape. We're announcing, major actions. It almost feels like by the week. It's not quite that way. We've got one coming out later today. And so our North Star is carrying out the core mission of our statutes, the core mission of the agency to protect human health and the environment, but ensuring that we're not imposing backbreaking compliance costs that are unnecessary, poorly targeted. I'll make one last point on that mercury rule that I referred to. When the Biden administration imposed those requirements, almost $700 million worth, their own economic analysis said for every dollar in benefits in that rule, it will take $2 of costs. It's a completely upside down cost-benefit analysis, and that's if you include climate benefits. And again, many of those benefits are derived from facilities closing because they would not be able to meet those requirements. We recently finalized a rule on wastewater emissions from power plants. When the Biden EPA imposed that rule, most of their benefits were not from reductions in water pollution. They were from reductions in air pollution of facilities that would close because they could not meet the regulatory water requirements. So again, we're taking a holistic look at the agency across the board. We're leaving in place and reforming the regulations that protect human health and the environment, and we're getting rid of the onerous, costly regulations that do not.
Thank you. Chair Lucas, when I introduced you, I indicated that the EEOC is an executive branch agency. You took special note of that and really emphasized that, even indicating that historically, especially in the context of litigation, that's been the position of EEOC all along. One question that I have, and it's pretty good evidence of the executive branch nature of your agency, is the level of energetic follow-through that you've had with regard to presidential priorities, especially two executive orders from my research: Executive Order 14188 on combating anti-Semitism and Executive Order 14202 on anti-Christian bias. Can you unpack that a little bit and lay out what some of the Title VII enforcement, public education, investigations, and litigation looks like?
Sure. Yeah, I think that you can be an executive branch agency behind the scenes, but if you don't act like one publicly, that's really problematic. As I said at the start of my remarks, the agency since the 70s has taken the position that we're an executive branch agency, which means that, among other things, we send our rules and policy documents to OIRA and OMB, and you do have coordination with the White House. But if the public doesn't see that, it can feel like you're a lawless independent agency. And so when you get an executive order, you want to be not only following all of the behind-the-scenes regulatory traps that one must do, but you should be speaking loudly and in concert with the executive so that the public knows, A, that they're educated about their rights, and that B, that you're actually carrying through on them. So like you said, we have been, a couple of the executive orders that we've been tasked with are I am one of the named members of the Eradicating Anti-Christian Bias Task Force. We just recently had an amazing premiere. I see Camille in the audience who helped organize that from the DOJ's side of the House. And so all of the agencies that are participating in that task force worked together to look at the ways the federal government had engaged in anti-Christian bias. And from the EEOC's perspective, a lot of that was a failure to use our authority to execute the law to protect Christians from anti-Christian bias. Some of the other agencies were more focused on things that they had been doing to their own employees, but from the agency's perspective, EEOC's perspective, we had a solemn duty to protect workers and allow them to be able to have religious accommodations. And during the COVID vaccine mandate push, thousands of workers found themselves faced with a dilemma about whether or not they would violate their conscience. Many of them were pro-life Christians who had a sincere religious belief that taking a vaccine that had been either contained and or had been tested on fetal cells would conflict with that pro-life religious-based belief, and thousands of them chose to be terminated rather than take that vaccine. Now, I'm myself a conservative pro-life Christian, and I took the vaccine. This isn't about personal politics. I didn't personally feel that religious belief, but that was a sincere belief for many, many workers, and they had a right to seek a religious accommodation. And the agency had a duty to say to them that we would protect you, both publicly announcing that we would protect you, and then taking public action so that workers knew that that would be treated seriously. But instead, what the agency did was bury those claims. We received 13,000 claims, charges, and there would have been more if we had done more publicly about it. And we handled some of them well and some of them poorly, but we did almost all of them very silently. And what you choose to talk about, educate the public on, bring a public conciliation on, bring a lawsuit on, tells people what their rights are. The average worker is not reading through the CFR or reading even a government web page. They're living and seeing someone take them seriously. They're seeing their employer change policies. They're seeing actual money in their bank account or not. And so the money that the agency recovered silently did not change a lot of employers' actions. And we've done something quite radically different, like I said, millions of dollars for religious workers, and in particular on the COVID vaccine mandate charges. We only had a remnant. Many of the charges have been dismissed by the prior administration, issued a notice of right to sue. Some people sued on their own, some didn't. But we only had a remnant of that 13,000. And yet from that remnant, we have now recovered close to $23 million for those claims alone. Hundreds of workers have recovered. Many of them are getting their jobs back. We are trying to right the wrongs of workers who were ignored. On anti-Semitism, there too, the agency has historically given the message and impression to many Jewish workers that they were not the right kind of victims, that they were in the eyes of, and I've literally had some direct quotes from EEOC employees who no longer work there, the Jewish employees were white and or rich, and they were not the right kind of victims. That's deeply anti-Semitic and problematic. And if I try to give those individuals the benefit of the doubt, I think that they were trying to focus on other people they viewed as vulnerable and not insulting another category of group. But in practice, it was deeply wrong. And I want to be very clear: if you're Jewish, you are welcome at the agency. We will take your rights seriously. And it's the same thing if you're white or you're wealthy. Again, it doesn't matter. If there's been grave harm, that's what we should be focusing on, not a particular group. And so what does that look like? It's been the most robust work on anti-Semitism the agency has done. In 10 years, I look at this 10-year sort of snapshot, this comparison. In 10 years, across multiple administrations, Republican and Democrat, the agency had brought 3 merits lawsuits on behalf of Jewish individuals. And that's pretty much all it had done publicly prior to 25. And in the 15 months of the Trump administration, we've brought 3 merits lawsuits just in that 15-month period of time. We have a subpoena enforcement action against the University of Pennsylvania, which we won and now is being appealed. We completed an entire gigantic investigation, referred it to the Department of Justice to sue the University of California, and we've recovered a $21 million pot of money for hundreds, possibly thousands of Jewish employees at Columbia. That's just 15 months. So we're loudly, aggressively, clearly educating people that if the president gives us an executive order, we will execute on it and we'll deliver results immediately.
Thank you. Deputy Secretary Vaden, this question builds on the nuance and also, I wouldn't call it the final mile, but the final 10 miles of fraud detection and program integrity. Many of us lawyers are aware of the case Goldberg versus Kelly from 1970 that imposed substantial, I think perhaps maximal due process protections on individuals on public assistance benefits, incidentally in the state of New York, before they could be taken away, even if they were wrongly given from the start. So how does one, or how would you balance fraud detection, obviously easier to reduce erroneously given benefits from the start, and then the much more difficult removing benefits improperly given or fraudulently given?
Well, from my perspective, despite the, from my point of view, questionable ruling that you cite there, Goldberg v. Kelly, which was a focus of the civil procedure course at the Yale Law School when I was there, it's not as difficult as you might think, because the sad answer is, for years, the federal government hasn't even been trying to enforce the law. The fraud schemes that we are seeing, sure, there are some that are impressive in terms of their complexity, the number of people involved, and what have you. But the amount of money that is being siphoned from the federal taxpayer by run-of-the-mill fraud that is easily detectable if you cared to ask the question. I mean, literally all we had to do to determine that with the 29 states whose data we have, that there are 186,000 dead people on the rolls,
Yep.
is take that data and give it to the Social Security Administration and say, please run it against your death master file.
To my knowledge, the dead do not have due process rights.
Only in the state of Illinois, where they're also allowed to vote. But, and we don't have their data either. But these things are because no one has cared. The Laring Center in Minnesota got a lot of attention. We asked ourselves the question, we don't think it's limited to the state of Minnesota. Not long after that, we used undercover officers that we have, including from our Inspector General's office at USDA, to go to a location in another Midwestern state. And all we did is, this is a state that, this is a facility which receives millions of dollars in taxpayer funding under CACFP, which is a communal feeding program. It is a location where people in need in that community know that they can go and receive a good, healthy meal, and the federal taxpayers are paying for it. Its job is very simple. It is to be open during set hours and serving people. We sent agents to that facility over the course of a week. It was dark, it was closed, there were no meals being served, there were no employees there. In this program, reimbursements are sought every other week. So we waited the 2 weeks. Sure enough, you know what happened. We got a request for payment for the full amount as though they had been open for that entire time period and serving meals like they had committed to do, when instead they're just sticking the money in their pocket and doing who knows what with it. Again, these are not complex schemes. And I wish it were limited to food stamps and feeding programs, but it's not. In recent weeks, I've been briefed on ongoing investigations involving crop insurance and loans put out by the previous administration through our Rural Development Mission area. Each of these investigations involves monies that are 9 figures in amount, and will end up resulting in criminal action being taken. No one cared to ask a question. The RD one was one I flagged myself as deputy secretary. You can imagine the number of things that cross my desk every day. But in looking at this particular program and what was going on, I just said, there's no way this just does not make sense. I referred it to the Inspector General, and sadly, I was correct. Fraudulent. And so there are legal hurdles. There are judges who sometimes want to stand in the way because they mistake their own policy beliefs for the law. But the real problem that we're finding and that the Fraud Task Force is addressing is that for far too long, under administrations, sadly, of both parties, but not under this administration, they haven't even cared to ask the question, is this a legitimate enterprise?
Thank you. So with the remaining time that we have, about 4 or 5 minutes, let's do Q&A from the audience. You?
Okay, great panel. So my thinking is going also to our last speaker, Mr. Vaden, and the SNAP program, which I've read quite a bit about. It is my understanding that other than the states, the principal client group of the SNAP program are the grocery stores. So you take a wonderful company like Walmart, and it's got kind of an adverse interest against this enforcement, as well as enforcing illegal immigration, because it's a base of their client base. I'm just curious if, as a group, an industry group, are you getting pushback, support, neutrality for the business of stamping out fraud and limiting the program to where it actually is supposed to be? And if I could also follow up on the last question about enforcement, Mehmet Oz, I read something about for the Medicare reimbursement or Medicaid, he's actually they tried to actually stop payments going back to the states, which sets up a political firestorm of messaging. Maybe that's where we have to go. Is that something you would consider for the joint, can the Fraud Task Force say, we're just not going to even reimburse your food stamps to the states unless you clean up the fraud and put in an appropriate program. Thank you.
Your questions are very good, and it's clear you understand basic economics. You are correct that the other large beneficiary of the food stamp program is not the American farmer, as is sometimes laid out. It is the American grocery store retailer. During the president's first term, there was a Freedom of Information Act request that was filed by a newspaper in, of all places, South Dakota. And what they wanted to do was get access to how much the grocery stores in their small community there in South Dakota were receiving in food stamp benefits. And I think that as a matter of transparency, that is information that every American should have. How many billions of dollars go to Walmart, Kroger, Aldi, whatever your favorite grocery store are? There is a trade group in this town called the Food Marketing Institute. That's the grocery stores. They were decidedly not in favor of having that information come out in public. They took it all the way to the Supreme Court, and they won. So currently, under the state of the law, though you can go onto Google and you can find every farmer in this country who received a $500 commodity support payment from USDA, their home address, exactly how much they got, what their name is, et cetera, et cetera. Google, you'll find it. It's public information. You can't find out how much these huge multinational corporations are taking of your tax dollars as effectively a subsidy through the SNAP program. Now, the second part of your question about withholding money, we do have authority to do that. We have sought to do that. We cannot withhold money under the congressional statute from the recipients themselves. But we do have authority to withhold it from the states, because here's the thing about the food stamp program. It's administered by the states, and the federal taxpayer not only pays the beneficiary's amount, but we pay the states to administer it. So on average, we put out something, these are round numbers, but they give you an idea. We put out about $9 billion a month in the food stamp program. Roughly a little more than $7 billion of that goes to individual beneficiaries. The remaining amount goes to the states to run the program. Under the law at issue here, we are entitled to the data. And it also says that if we make a request, a lawful request to the states to help us with the administration of the program, and the states refuse to abide by that request, we have the legal authority to withhold the administration funds from them, which would basically prevent them from being able to run the program and force their hand. Those 21 states who sued us got a Clinton-appointed district judge in where else, California, to issue the most interesting ruling you'll ever have the time to read. Because in that ruling, she says two things. She says, USDA, you are correct on the law. They do have to hand the data over. She disagreed with us on one statutory authority that we had cited, but she agreed on a second one, yes, you're owed the data. But then somehow she got to the conclusion, and if you can figure out how she got to it, please let me know, you're a better lawyer than I, you're nonetheless enjoined from doing that. And so currently we are enjoined from enforcing a law that a federal court has said we are correct in our interpretation of what it says. And if you're wondering how effective this tool is, I mentioned earlier about Kansas. This is kind of an interesting thing in not federalism, but also kind of division of power within states and how they have chosen to divide power separately in their own state constitutions and how it has interesting consequences. In the state of Kansas, you have an elected Democrat governor. You also have an elected Republican attorney general who's in charge of all litigation there under the law. So the Democrat governor of Kansas originally said, I'm not going to give you the data. But the Republican Attorney General of Kansas would not sue and join that lawsuit that the 21 other states are. So we sent the governor of Kansas a letter that said, you're going to turn over that data to us within X number of days or we're taking your administrative funds. We've got her data. We're currently stuck in procedural hell before this Clinton judge, who is desperately trying to find a way out of the fix she got herself into by writing, making the mistake that she did, which was, at least in her legal interpretation, play it halfway straight and say we're entitled to the data. And she's currently busy trying to set a briefing schedule that will end sometime in 2029 with regard to this. But we're going to get the data. There are other options that are available to us. I won't discuss those here publicly. But one thing is very clear. The states whose data we have, while disturbing, we don't believe they are the worst offenders in terms of how they are running the program. And we are very anxious to get the data from these other states that we have reason to believe may not have even done as much as the states we do have to try to target fraud and run the program in a responsible way.
Well, thank you so much, and my apologies to the other questioners. We are out of time. Let's give a round of applause to our discussants.